History tells us freedom is never given, it is seized. But Robert Smalls didn't just escape slavery, he hijacked a Confederate gunboat and delivered it to the Union Navy. Witness the true story of the most audacious heist of the American Civil War. If you love uncovering the untold true stories of American history like this one, crush that subscribe button and hit the bell right now. Chapter 1. The Wheelman of Charleston Harbour. The salt air of Charleston Harbour did not smell like freedom. In the spring of 1862, it smelled of pluff mud, unwashed wool, and the sulphurous sting of gunpowder. Robert Smalls stood at the helm of the CSS Planter, his hands resting lightly on the spokes of the ship's wheel. He did not grip them white-knuckled as a novice might. He held them with the familiarity of a man holding his own child. To the casual observer, or perhaps to the Confederate officers who technically commanded this vessel, Robert was merely property, a gullah man born in a slave cabin behind a Beaufort house, leased out to the Confederacy for $16 a month, of which he was allowed to keep only one. But to the currents of the Cooper River, to the shifting sandbars that guarded the harbor like submerged teeth, and to the tides that breathed in and out of the low country, Robert Smalls was a master. He was 23 years old, stocky and broad-shouldered, with a face that often held a carefully constructed mask of indifference. Behind that mask was a mind that was constantly calculating, measuring depth, wind speed, and the lethal geometry of the Confederate defenses. "Easy to port, Robert," a voice drawled from the deck chair behind him. It was Captain Charles C.C.J. Relay. The Confederate officer was nursing a cigar, his hat tilted low over his eyes to shield them from the glare of the southern sun. "Aye, sir, easy to port," Robert replied, his voice steady, his gullah accent thick but clear. Robert turned the wheel not because Relay had ordered it, but because he knew the currents around Castle Pinckney were treacherous this time of day. If he followed the water's natural pull, the Planter, a 149-foot side-wheel steamer converted into an armed transport, would drift too close to the shoals. Robert had already adjusted the course in his mind 3 seconds before Relay had spoken. He allowed the white officers to believe they were commanding the ship, just as he allowed them to believe he was content with his chains. It was safer that way. The Planter churned through the water, its wood-burning engines coughing black smoke into the pristine blue sky. As the ship cut through the harbor, the skyline of Charleston rose like a mirage. It was a city of breathtaking beauty and terrifying contradictions. Stately church steeples pierced the heavens, their bells ringing out hymns of salvation, while beneath their shadows, human beings were bought and sold on the auction blocks. The grand mansions of the Battery, with their multi-tiered piazzas and manicured gardens, looked out over the water, monuments to a wealth built on backs like Robert's. But in 1862, the beauty was marred by the scars of war. The city was under martial law. A great fire the previous year had left a jagged black scar across the metropolis, a wound that refused to heal, and everywhere there were guns. Robert's eyes scanned the perimeter. This harbor was the most heavily fortified location in the entire Confederacy. To his right lay Fort Johnson, to his left the batteries of Fort Moultrie, and directly ahead, squatting in the mouth of the harbor like a dormant volcano, was Fort Sumter. It was here that the war had begun, where the first shots were fired to sever the Union. Now the massive brick fortress bristled with heavy artillery, its cannons pointing outward, daring the Union Navy to approach. And the Union Navy was there. Robert squinted against the sun, looking past the terror of Sumter towards the open Atlantic. He could see them, faint, skeletal shapes on the horizon, the blockade, the Anaconda Plan in action. The USS Onward, the USS Augusta, and a dozen other Federal ships formed a wooden wall about 7 miles out. To the Confederate officers on the Planter, those ships represented tyranny and invasion. To Robert Smalls, those distant masts looked like the gates of heaven. "Stop daydreaming, boy, and watch the channel," the mate,
A man named Smith barked as he walked past, spitting tobacco juice onto the deck. "Yes, sir," Robert said, dipping his head slightly, a gesture of submission that he had perfected since childhood. He wasn't daydreaming, he was memorizing. Every day for months, Robert had been piloting the Planter back and forth between the city wharves and the island forts. He carried supplies, ammunition, and heavy guns to the Confederate outposts. He knew the location of every torpedo, naval mine, laid in the channels. He knew the specific whistle signals required to pass the checkpoints. He knew the shift changes of the sentries at Fort Sumter. He knew that the Planter was a unique prize. It was a shallow draft vessel capable of navigating the winding creeks and inlets where the massive Union frigates could not go. It was armed with a 32-pounder pivot gun on the bow and a 24-pounder howitzer on the aft. Currently, its hold was filled with 4 dismantled guns from Coles Island that were meant to be transported to the forts the next day. As the sun began to dip lower, casting the water in hues of violent orange and purple, Robert steered the Planter back toward the southern wharf. The day's work was exhausting, but it was the psychological weight that crushed him. He was a man who possessed the skills of a captain, the intelligence of a strategist, and the heart of a lion. Yet, by law, he was legally equivalent to the livestock he sometimes transported. He docked the ship with a gentleness that belied the vessel's bulk. The ropes were thrown, the gangplank lowered. The day's work for the Confederacy was done, but Robert's work was never finished. That evening, Robert was granted a brief pass to go ashore. He walked through the cobblestone streets of Charleston, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with the patrols. The city felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Confederate conscription acts were dragging more men into the meat grinder of war, and the Union pressure was mounting. He made his way to a small, cramped room where his wife Hannah and their 2 children lived. Hannah was a hotel maid owned by a different master. Their marriage, though sanctified in their hearts and by their community, had no legal standing in South Carolina. At any moment, a master's debt or a whim could send Hannah to a plantation in Texas and Robert to the interior, never to see each other again. When he entered the room, the tension was palpable. Hannah was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding their infant son. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. "They sellin' people down at the exchange today, Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I heard Master King talkin'. He needs money." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. The fear of separation was the constant shadow that haunted every slave family. It was a terror worse than the whip. He looked at his daughter, barely a toddler, playing on the floor with a rag doll. He imagined her growing up without him, or worse, growing up to be sold, used, and discarded by a system that saw her as profit rather than a person. He sat beside Hannah and took her rough, calloused hands in his. He looked at the window, toward the dark outline of the harbor where the Planter bobbed in the tide. The atmosphere of Charleston was suffocating, a heavy blanket of oppression that choked the life out of his people. But out there, past the stone walls of Sumter, the air was different. Robert Smalls was done being the wheelman for the Confederacy. It was time to take the wheel for himself. He turned back to his wife, his eyes hard and bright in the dim lamplight. "Get your children ready," he said. "We are going to steel ourselves."
Chapter 2. A Vow Made in Whispers. The Cooper River at midnight was a graveyard of shadows. The water lapped against the hull of the CSS Planter with a rhythmic, hypnotic slap, a sound that usually lulled the crew to sleep after 14 hours of hauling heavy artillery. But tonight, sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Robert Smalls sat on a coil of rope in the forecastle, the cramped, humid quarter shared by the ship's enslaved crew. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and the lingering grease of the engine room. Huddled around him were the men he trusted with his life, men he was about to ask to risk theirs. There was John Smalls, the steamer's engineer,
no relation to Robert, though they shared a surname and a bond of brotherhood. There was William Morrison and Alfred Gradine. They were skilled sailors, men who knew the mechanics of a steam engine better than the white officers who barked orders at them. But in the eyes of the law, they were property. "You talking crazy, Robert," John whispered, his voice barely audible over the creak of the ship's timbers. He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes wide and white in the gloom. "Steal the Planter? This ain't a rowboat. This is a Confederate transport. They got guns on every point of this harbor." "And we got guns on this deck," Robert countered, his voice steady, anchoring the fear in the room. "We got a 32-pounder and a 24-pounder, and right now we got 4 more guns in the hold meant for the middle ground battery." "Fat lot of good guns do us if we get blown out the water by Fort Sumter," Alfred hissed, looking toward the hatch as if Captain Relay was storm in. But Relay was ashore, sleeping in a feather bed. The crew was alone. Robert leaned in closer, the lantern light casting deep hollows in his face. "Listen to me. You know the talk on the streets. You hear what the officers say when they think we ain't listening. They act like they win in this war, but they scared. They conscript in every man they can find, and when they get desperate, what do they do with their property?" He let the question hang in the heavy air. "They turn it into cash," Robert answered his own question. "They sellin' families apart every day. Master King is looking to sell Hannah. Your wife, John? Your boy? How long before their masters need quick money? A week? A month?" The men fell silent. The threat of sale was the universal nightmare, the specter that stood at the foot of every slave's bed. To be sold down the river to the sugar plantations of Louisiana or the cotton fields of Mississippi was a death sentence for a family. "I ain't gonna let them take my family," Robert said, his voice hardening into steel. "I'd rather see them dead than enslaved and scattered. I'd rather see them in the grave than in the hands of a breaker." "So what's the plan, Robert? How are we gonna pass the forts? You got the password?" "I got better than the password." He reached under his bunk and pulled out a bundle of cloth. He unfolded it to reveal a wide-brimmed straw hat. The men stared at it. It was identical to the one Captain Relay wore every day. "From the back, in the dark, I look like him. I know the signals. I know the whistle blows, 2 long, 1 short for the rebel forts. I know the water. If we leave at night, just before dawn, the sentries won't look too close. They'll see the Planter, they'll see the captain's hat, and they'll wave us through." "And if they don't?" John asked. "If they ask for the countersign? If the onward out there doesn't see our white flag and opens fire?" Robert looked each man in the eye. This was the moment of truth. This was the vow. "We don't get taken alive," Robert said. The gravity of his words sucked the air out of the room. "If the batteries open fire on us, we steam full speed ahead. If they catch us, we blow the ship." He gestured to the floorboards, beneath which lay the boiler and the ammunition stores. "We scuttle her. We lock the families in the cabin so they don't suffer, and we ignite the powder. We go down with the ship. We cross over to Jordan one way or another, either as free men in the north or as free spirits in the water. But we do not go back to chains." There was a long, terrifying silence. The men were weighing their lives. They were weighing the certainty of slavery against the slim, jagged hope of freedom. One by one, they nodded. "I'm with you," John said. "I'm with you," Alfred added. The pact was sealed in the belly of the Confederate warship, but the hardest part was yet to come. They had to organize the cargo, their wives, children, and loved ones. The following days were a blur of agonizing secrecy. Robert had to communicate the plan to Hannah without alerting the neighbors or the masters. They used the grapevine, the complex, invisible network of communication that slaves had perfected over centuries. A hummed tune, a specific laundry arrangement, a whisper in the marketplace. Robert met with the women in the dead of night behind a warehouse on the wharf. The women were terrified. The plan required them to hide on a different steamer, the Etowah, which was docked nearby, and then transfer to the Planter at a specific time. Hannah clutched Robert's arm, her knuckles white. "Robert, the baby, if he cries—" "He won't cry," Robert promised, though he couldn't know that. "You wrap him tight, you pray, and you trust me." The tension in Charleston was ramping up. The Union blockade was tightening its grip, strangling the city's commerce. The Confederate officers were becoming more agitated, more paranoid. Every time Captain Riley looked at Robert, Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. Does he know? Can he see it in my eyes? But Riley saw only the good boy, the talented wheelman who made his job easy. Riley's arrogance was Robert's greatest weapon. The man who polished his boots was plotting the greatest naval theft of the century. By May 12th, the plan was set. The Planter had been loaded with the heavy guns destined for the forts. The ship was fully fueled with wood. The stars were aligning. That afternoon, Robert stood on the deck, watching the sun begin its descent. He saw Captain Riley and the other two white officers, the mate and the engineer, talking and laughing. They were dressed in their shore clothes. "Smalls!" Riley shouted. "Yes, sir," Robert jogged. "We're going ashore for the evening. There's a ball tonight. We'll be back in the morning. You keep the fires banked. Make sure she's ready to sail at sunrise." "Aye, sir," Robert said, keeping his face blank. "Ready at sunrise." It was the moment they had been waiting for. It was against Confederate regulations for the white officers to leave the ship entirely in the hands of the slave crew. But Riley had done it before. He trusted Robert. He was comfortable. He was careless. As the three officers walked down the gangplank and disappeared into the gas-lit streets of Charleston, Robert watched them go. He felt a cold sweat prickling his skin. He turned to John Smalls, who was watching from the engine room hatch. "This is it. Tonight." The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the harbor into darkness. The Planter was now under the command of General Robert Smalls, though the world didn't know it yet. The vow made in whispers was about to scream across the water.
Chapter 3. The Officer's Night Ashore. The sun began to bleed into the horizon on the evening of May 12, 1862, painting the Charleston skyline in bruising shades of purple and crimson. On the deck of the CSS Planter, the air was thick with the humidity of the low country and the unspoken tension of the crew. Robert Smalls stood near the gangplank, a coil of rope in his hands, watching the three white officers emerge from the cabin. They were dressed not for war, but for leisure. Their uniforms were brushed clean of coal dust, their boots polished to a mirror shine, and the scent of bay rum and tobacco smoke wafted around them, masking the stench of the pluff mud that permeated the harbor. Captain Charles C.J. Riley adjusted his collar, looking toward the gas-lit streets of the city with an expression of anticipation. Beside him stood the pilot, Samuel Smith, and the engineer, Zerwick. They were men of status in a city fighting for its right to own men like Robert. "Smalls," Riley barked, not looking at him, but rather through him. "Yes, sir," Robert replied, his posture slumped just enough to appear non-threatening, his eyes lowered in the customary performance of deference. "We're heading ashore for the evening. There is a gathering at the Fort Sumter house, and I intend to enjoy a civilized meal for once," Riley said, lighting a fresh cigar. "We will return at sunrise to move the guns to the middle ground. Make sure the Planter is ready." "Aye, sir. Ready at sunrise," Robert said, his voice steady. It was a casual command, given with the supreme confidence of a man who believed his world was immutable. Yet in that moment, Riley was committing a court-martial offense. General Roswell Ripley, the Confederate commander of the district, had issued strict orders. Under no circumstances were all white officers to leave a vessel unmanned by white personnel. It was a safeguard against exactly what was brewing in Robert's mind. But Captain Riley was comfortable. He was in the heart of the Confederacy, surrounded by ring after ring of fortifications.
The idea that his slaves, his boys, would attempt to steal a 147-foot sidewheel steamer was as absurd to him as the idea of a horse solving a calculus equation. "Keep the fires banked, but don't burn through all the wood," the engineer added, pointing a finger at John Smalls, who was wiping grease from a piston rod. "I don't want to spend the morning loading fuel." "Yes, boss, I keep 'em low," John mumbled, keeping his head down. The three officers laughed at some private joke as they descended the gangplank, their boots clattering rhythmically against the wood. Robert watched them go. He watched them step onto the southern wharf, watched them walk past the sentries who nodded respectfully, and watched them disappear into the labyrinth of Charleston's streets. As their silhouettes faded into the deepening twilight, the atmosphere on the Planter underwent a violent shift. The performance was over. Robert straightened his spine. The slump vanished. His eyes, no longer cast downward, swept the deck with the sharp, predatory intensity of a commander. He turned to the crew, John, William, Alfred, and the others. They were all looking at him, their faces masks of terror and exhilaration. "They're gone," Robert said, his voice low but cutting through the silence like a knife. "God have mercy," John breathed out, leaning against the bulkhead as if his legs had suddenly lost their strength. "It's the hand of Providence," Robert said, moving quickly to the wheelhouse to check the view. "General Ripley's orders say they shouldn't leave, but arrogance makes men blind. They think we are too stupid to run this ship and too scared to try." He looked out at the wharf. The sentries were still there, pacing their beats, but they were accustomed to the comings and goings of the Planter. To them, the black crew moving about the deck was just part of the background scenery, laborers doing the bidding of their masters. "Listen to me," Robert commanded, gathering the men close. "We have until dawn. The tide will be right around 3 a.m. That gives us a few hours to get the families on board." This was the most dangerous part of the prelude. The Planter was docked at the southern wharf, a busy area even at night. To bring women and children onto a Confederate warship without raising an alarm required nerves of steel. "John," Robert said, "keep the pressure in the boilers just enough to move when we need to, but don't make smoke. We can't look like we're prepping for a voyage yet." "What about the patrol boat?" William asked, gesturing toward the dark water where a Confederate guard boat rode its rounds. "We wait for it to pass," Robert said. "We act like we are cleaning the decks. We act like we are nothing." He looked up at the Confederate flag, the stars and bars fluttering lazily from the mast. It was the symbol of their bondage. In a few hours, if they were successful, he would tear it down. If they failed, it would be the last thing he saw before the hangman's noose or the cannon fire of Fort Sumter claimed him. "Tonight is the night we stop being property," Robert whispered, more to himself than the others. He looked at the empty cabin captain, where Relay's straw hat hung on a peg. He walked over to the cabin door and touched the handle. It was unlocked. "Get the signal ready for the Etowah," Robert ordered, referring to the nearby steamer where some of the families were hiding. "When the wharf sentry turns his back to walk the other way, we move." The officers were ashore, drinking to the Confederacy and their own superiority. They believed the Planter was safe, tethered to the dock like a sleeping dog. They did not know that the dog had slipped its collar, and the wolf was now in charge. Robert Smalls took a deep breath of the salt air. For the first time in his life, it didn't smell like the harbor. It smelled like the calm before the storm. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Wharf. At 3 a.m., the moon was a sliver of bone in a sky choked with clouds. The city of Charleston slept the fitful sleep of a war-weary giant. But on the deck of the CSS Planter, the world was wide awake and trembling. Robert Smalls stood in the pilot house, his hands gripping the wheel. He looked out at the southern wharf where the ship had been docked. The easy part was over. The white officers were gone, and the crew was united. Now came the first great gamble. "Cast off the stern line," Robert ordered, his voice a low rumble. John Smalls and Alfred Gradine moved like ghosts. The heavy hemp ropes splashed silently into the black water. The paddle wheels groaned as they began to turn, churning the harbor sludge. The Planter drifted away from the dock, not with the aggressive speed of a warship, but with the lazy, confident pace of a vessel on a routine mission. But they weren't heading for the forts yet, not without the most precious cargo of all. Robert steered the ship toward the West Atlantic wharf. This was a deviation from any normal schedule, a move that could instantly arouse suspicion if a vigilant patrol boat spotted them. But it was here, in the shadow of another Confederate steamer, the Etowah, that the families were hiding. As the Planter approached the wharf, the silhouette of the Etowah loomed large and silent. Robert scanned the dark recesses of the dock. Nothing moved. For a terrifying second, he thought they hadn't come, that the fear had been too great, or that they had been captured on their way to the rendezvous. Then, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. It was Hannah. She was huddled near a stack of crates, holding their daughter Elizabeth tightly against her chest. Their son, Robert Jr., was clinging to her skirts. Behind her were the wives and children of the other crew members, 5 women and 3 children in total. They were statues of fear, frozen in the darkness, waiting for a signal. Robert didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply brought the Planter alongside the wharf with a delicate precision that defied the ship's bulk. The vessel kissed the dock pilings with barely a sound. "Get them aboard," Robert whispered to the crew on the lower deck. "Fast, and for God's sakes, quiet." The gangplank was slid across. It was a bridge between slavery and the unknown. Hannah stepped onto it first. Her eyes met Robert's through the glass of the pilot house. There was no joy in her gaze, only a terrified trust. She moved quickly, her bare feet silent on the wood. The other women followed, their movements jerky and nervous. One of the children stumbled, a small gasp escaping their lips. On the wharf, a Confederate sentinel patrolling a block away paused. He turned his head, squinting into the darkness toward the sound. On the Planter, every heart stopped. John Smalls froze near the boiler, his hand hovering over a lever. If the sentinel shouted, if he raised his musket, the alarm would sound across the harbor. The heavy guns of the shore batteries would turn toward them before they could even build up a head of steam. The sentinel took a step toward them. He saw the outline of the Planter. He saw movement. But then he saw something else. He saw the confident, casual way the ship was idling. He saw a figure in the pilot house wearing the distinctive straw hat and long overcoat of Captain Relay. Just the Planter, the sentinel likely thought, moving out early for the forts. Typical Relay, always pushing his boys. The sentinel turned back to his beat, resuming his slow walk into the night. On the deck, the breath rushed out of the crew in a collective sigh. The women and children were hurried down the hatch into the cargo hold. This was for their safety, but also for the deception. A Confederate warship did not carry women and babies. If they were seen on deck, the Planter would be fired upon immediately. "Everyone down," Alfred hissed, ushering his wife below. "Stay behind the cotton bales. Don't make a sound until Robert tells you." Hannah paused at the bottom of the ladder, looking back up at the pilot house where her husband stood alone. She couldn't see his face, only the brim of the straw hat and the stiff collar of the captain's coat. He looked like the enemy, but he was their only hope. Below deck, the air was stifling. The children were settled into the corners, their mothers shushing them with desperate urgency. They were sitting on top of enough gunpowder to blow the ship to splinters, but the real danger was outside. Robert watched until the last head disappeared below deck. The deck was clear. To the world, the Planter was now a military vessel on a standard transport run. He checked the steam pressure gauge. It was rising. The beast was waking up. "All clear?" he called down the speaking tube to the engine room. "All clear, Captain," John's voice came back, the title heavy with a new, dangerous reality. Robert gripped the wheel. His palms were slick with sweat. The easy part was truly over. Now lay the gauntlet. 4 Confederate forts, armed with hundreds of cannons, all expecting a signal from a white captain. He turned the wheel, swinging the bow of the Planter toward the open harbor, toward Fort Johnson, toward the point of no return. The shadows of the wharf fell away behind them, swallowed by the wake of the paddle wheels. There was no going back to the cabins, no going back to the masters. They were fugitives on the open water. Robert pulled the cord for the steam whistle. Whoo, whoo. The sound was lonely and mournful in the dark. It was time to run the blockade.
Chapter 5. Donning the Straw Hat. The CSS Planter churned away from the wharf, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of its paddle wheels echoing off the silent warehouses of Charleston. The city was receding into the mist, a sleeping monster that had not yet realized its prey was escaping. Inside the pilot house, Robert Smalls stood alone. The small, glass-enclosed room was the nerve center of the ship, but tonight it was also his dressing room. The plan relied on 2 things: the cover of darkness and the arrogance of the enemy. The Confederate sentries at the harbor forts, Fort Johnson, Fort Ripley, Castle Pinckney, and the formidable Fort Sumter, were trained to look for shapes, not details. They looked for the familiar outline of a Confederate transport. They looked for the specific whistle signals. And most importantly, they looked for the white captain who commanded it. Robert stepped away from the wheel for a fleeting second, engaging the locking mechanism to keep the rudder steady. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that was flooding his system like a drug. He reached for the bundle he had stashed in the corner. First came the coat. It was a heavy, double-breasted navy pea coat, the kind Captain Relay wore to ward off the chill of the early morning mist. Robert slid his arms into the sleeves. The wool was scratchy and smelled of Relay's tobacco smoke, the scent of authority, the scent of the master. It was a smell Robert had associated with servitude for years, but as he buttoned the brass toggles across his chest, the meaning changed. It was no longer a symbol of oppression. It was armor. Next came the hat. It was a wide-brimmed straw hat, distinct and unmistakable. In Charleston Harbour, that hat was as good as a signature. Everyone knew Captain Relay wore it, rain or shine, often tilted at a rakish angle to shield his eyes from the glare. Robert picked it up. The straw felt brittle under his fingers. He took a breath, expanding his lungs against the tight constraint of the coat, and placed the hat on his head. He pulled the brim low, shadowing his face. He turned to the small, grime-streaked mirror bolted to the bulkhead. In the dim light of the binnacle lamp, a stranger looked back at him. The broad nose, the dark skin, the eyes that had seen too much sorrow, they were all hidden in the deep shade of the brim. All that remained was the silhouette. He wasn't Robert Smalls, the slave. He wasn't Boy. In the dark alchemy of the night, he had become the captain. "God help us," a voice whispered from the doorway. It was Alfred Grandine. He had come up from the deck to check the course. He froze, staring at Robert. For a heartbeat, pure terror flashed across Alfred's face, the instinctive, conditioned fear of seeing the white master standing where he shouldn't be. "It's me, Alfred," Robert said, his voice low and calm. Alfred let out a shaky breath, clutching his chest. "Lord, Robert, for a second there I thought Relay had come back from the dead. You look just like him."
"That's the point," Robert said, turning back to the wheel. "Now get below. Tell everyone to stay hidden. If anyone so much as coughs when we pass Johnson, we're finished." Alfred nodded and vanished back into the shadows of the deck. Robert took his position at the wheel. He didn't just stand, he posed. He had spent years studying Captain Riley, not out of admiration, but out of survival. He knew how Riley stood with his weight on his left leg. He knew Riley crossed his arms over his chest, hands tucked into his armpits, projecting an air of bored superiority. Robert adopted the stance. He crossed his arms. He leaned back slightly. He tilted his head just so. The transformation was complete. The Planter was no longer a stolen vessel. To any eyes watching from the shore, it was simply the Planter doing what the Planter always did, working while the rest of the city slept. Ahead, the dark shape of Fort Johnson loomed out of the mist on James Island. This was the first test. The fort guarded the inner harbor, its guns were trained on the channel, and its sentries were always watching. Robert checked the steam. The ship was moving at a moderate pace, not too fast to look suspicious, not too slow to look hesitant. He had to time it perfectly. He reached for the whistle cord. This was the moment of truth. The Confederates had a specific code for their vessels. If he blew the wrong sequence, the fort would signal the alarm, and the Planter would be blown out of the water before they even reached Sumter. 2 long, 1 short. That was the signal. Robert's hand tightened on the cord. The sweat on his palm made the hemp slick. He thought of Hannah below deck, holding their children. He thought of the freedom that lay 7 miles away, past the line of fire. He pulled the cord. Hoo, hoo, hoo. The steam whistle shrieked into the night, the sound bouncing off the water. It sounded loud, too loud. To Robert's ears, it sounded like a scream for help. He waited. The ship chugged closer to the fort. He could see the lanterns on the ramparts. He could see the silhouette of a sentry walking the wall. The sentry stopped. He raised a lantern, swinging it out over the water to illuminate the vessel. Robert didn't flinch. He didn't duck. He stood in the window of the pilot house, the straw hat pulled low, his arms crossed in the distinctive Confederate fold. He kept the ship steady, sailing right through the pool of light cast by the lantern. He was daring them to shoot him. He was daring them to see him. The lantern lowered. He shouted something, a greeting, perhaps, or a confirmation. "Pass, the Planter," the voice drifted across the water. Robert didn't respond. Riley wouldn't have. Riley would have considered it beneath him to shout back at a common sentry. He simply raised a hand in a lazy, dismissive wave, another Riley trademark, and kept steering. The fort fell behind them. Robert let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a lifetime. His knees felt like water, but his hands were rock steady on the wheel. 1 down. But the hardest test was yet to come. Ahead lay the monster, Fort Sumter, and beyond that, the open sea. The straw hat stayed firmly on his head. The masquerade had begun, and there was no taking off the costume until they were dead or free.
Chapter 6. The Gauntlet of Fort Johnson. The Cooper River widened as the CSS Planter steamed away from the city, the safety of the shadows replaced by the exposing gray of the open harbor. The water here was black and slick, hiding the sandbars that Robert knew by heart. But it was what stood above the water that terrified him. To the starboard side, the dark, brooding mass of James Island rose from the marsh. Perched on its edge was Fort Johnson. This was the first true test of the gauntlet. The sentries at the wharf back in Charleston were one thing, bored city guards used to commercial traffic. The men at Fort Johnson were soldiers. They manned heavy columbiads and rifled cannons capable of smashing the Planter's wooden hull into driftwood in seconds. Inside the pilot house, Robert felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine beneath the heavy wool coat. He forced his breathing to slow. In, out.
He had to be calm. Captain Relay was never nervous. Captain Relay owned the river. "Steady as she goes, John," Robert murmured into the speaking tube, his voice devoid of the terror gripping his heart. "Don't push her. Make it look lazy." "Aye, lazy it is," came the shaky reply from the engine room. The ship chugged closer. The fort was no longer a shape, it was a structure. Robert could see the outline of the parapets against the starry sky. He could see the faint glow of a watchfire. He reached for the whistle cord again. This was the moment that would decide their fate. If he pulled it too early, he looked eager. If he pulled it too late, he looked suspicious. If he faltered in the rhythm, he was a dead man. He waited until the planter was almost abreast of the fort's main battery. Whoo! Whoo! Whoop! 2 long blasts, 1 short, the Confederate signal for friendly vessel. The sound tore through the quiet night, echoing off the brick walls of the fort. It hung in the air, a brazen declaration of identity. To the soldiers on the ramparts, that sound meant supply run. It meant official business. It meant Captain Relay. To Robert, it sounded like a confession. He locked the wheel and stepped to the window, assuming the posture. He crossed his arms over his chest, burying his hands in the armpits of the coat to hide their color. He tilted the wide-brimmed straw hat down, obscuring his face in shadow. He leaned against the window frame, projecting an air of utter boredom. On the ramparts of Fort Johnson, a sentry stopped his pacing. He raised a musket, not to fire, but to salute. "Pass the planter," the sentry's voice drifted across the water, carried by the wind. "Blow the hell out of 'em, Captain." The soldier thought they were heading out to attack the Union blockade. The irony nearly made Robert's knees buckle. He didn't shout back. He simply raised a hand in a loose, dismissive wave, the Charleston wave that the aristocracy used for their inferiors. It was a gesture of arrogance that Robert had seen 1,000 times. Now he used it as a shield. The sentry lowered his weapon and resumed his walk. The planter glided past the guns. The black mouths of the cannons, which had been pointed directly at the pilot house, slowly drifted astern. Robert exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty his lungs entirely. They had done it. They had fooled the first line of defense. But there was no time for celebration. As Fort Johnson faded into the gloom behind them, a new, far more terrifying shape began to emerge from the gloom ahead. Fort Sumter. The pentagonal masonry sea fort sat on an artificial island in the middle of the harbor entrance, like a stone beast. It was the symbol of the Confederacy's power. It was where the war had started. It was armed with 3 tiers of heavy guns, manned by the most disciplined troops in the South. And unlike Fort Johnson, which was off to the side, the planter had to pass directly under the walls of Sumter to exit the harbor. "Robert?" Hannah's voice came from the hatch, a terrified whisper. "Are we through?" "We passed Johnson," Robert said, not taking his eyes off the approaching fortress. "Get back down, Hannah. The big one is coming up. And the sun is coming too." He glanced at the eastern horizon. The sky was lightening. The protective cloak of night was thinning with every passing minute. If the sun rose before they passed Sumter, the sentries would see his face. They would see the black crew. They would see the women and children. "Full steam," Robert whispered into the tube, changing the order. "Give me everything you got without blowing the stack." The planter surged forward, the vibration humming through the deck plates. They were racing the sun now. The gauntlet of Fort Johnson was behind them, but the jaws of Sumter were opening wide.
Chapter 7. Passing Sumter, the ultimate bluff. The eastern sky was no longer black. It was a bruising shade of violet, bleeding into a pale, treacherous gray. Dawn was breaking. For a fugitive, light was not a blessing, it was an accusation. Directly ahead, rising from the water like a man-made mountain of brick and mortar, sat Fort Sumter. It was the most formidable object in Robert Small's world. Its walls were scarred from the bombardment that had started the war a year earlier, but its teeth remained sharp. 3 tiers of heavy guns, columbiads, mortars, and rifled cannons pointed outward in a bristling 360-degree radius. It was the gatekeeper of the Confederacy, and the CSS Planter was about to walk right through the front door. "God be with us," Robert whispered, his throat dry as dust. Below deck, the silence was deafening. Hannah, the children, and the crew's families were huddled in the darkness of the hold, pressing their hands over the mouths of the babies. They knew exactly where they were. The vibration of the engine changed as the water grew shallower near the fort's foundation. They were sailing into the lion's den. In the pilot house, Robert locked his knees to stop them from shaking. He adjusted the straw hat, pulling the brim down until it nearly touched his nose. He buttoned the captain's pea coat to the chin, hiding his neck, his shirt, his skin, everything that could betray him. He was no longer Robert. He was Captain Relay, and Captain Relay was a man who expected obedience, not scrutiny. The Planter steamed closer. The fort was so close now that Robert could see the individual bricks. He could see the sentry, number 10, pacing the parapet high above. He could see the glint of a bayonet in the early morning light. It was time. Robert reached for the whistle cord. His hand hovered for a fraction of a second. If the signal was wrong, if the code had changed since yesterday, the sentry would shout, "Fire!" and the Planter would be turned into splintered wood and twisted iron in seconds. He pulled the cord. Woo, woo, whoop! The steam whistle cut through the morning mist. 2 long blasts, 1 short, the Confederate salute. The sound echoed off the high walls of the fort, bouncing back at them. Robert didn't wait for a response. He didn't slow down. He steered the ship steadily, maintaining the arrogant, leisurely pace of a Confederate transport on a routine mission. He opened the window of the pilot house and leaned out, just visible enough to be seen, but obscured enough to remain a mystery. He crossed his arms over his chest, Captain Relay's signature pose. He stood with his weight on one leg, head cocked slightly to the side, looking up at the ramparts with an air of utter boredom. High above, the sentry stopped. He looked down at the vessel passing beneath him. The distance was terrifyingly short. A stone thrown from the parapet could have hit the deck. The sentry squinted. He saw the ship. He saw the Confederate flag snapping in the wind at the stern. He saw the officer in the pilot house, the familiar straw hat, the crossed arms, the coat. "Pass the Planter!" the sentry bellowed, his voice booming over the water. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge the man with a shout. That would have been too risky. His voice might crack, or the gullah accent might slip through. Instead, he raised his hand in that same lazy, dismissive wave. "I hear you, soldier, as you were." "Throw the damn thing," another soldier on the wall shouted, referring to the whistle, a friendly jeer at the early hour. Robert didn't flinch. He kept the wheel steady. The Planter slid past the massive stone walls. The shadow of the fort fell over the ship, cold and heavy, and then it passed. They were through. As the ship cleared the angle of the fort, the open ocean lay before them. The blockade fleet of the Union Navy was visible now, tiny specks on the horizon, 7 miles away. Robert let out a breath that felt like a scream. He slumped against the wheel, his legs finally giving way for a moment. He looked back. The sentry at Sumter had resumed his pacing, completely unaware that he had just waved goodbye to a stolen warship and 16 escaped slaves. "We did it," Robert whispered. "We passed the monster." But as the relief washed over him, a new, chilling realization took its place. They were now in no man's land. To the Confederates behind them, they were still the Planter. But to the Union ships ahead, they were an enemy gunboat flying the stars and bars, steaming directly towards the blockade at full speed. The Union ships were already loading their cannons. "John!"
Robert shouted down the tube, his voice cracking with urgency. "Drop the flag! Get that rebel rag down now, and bring up the sheet!" The bluff had worked on the south. Now they had to survive the north.
Chapter 8. Beyond the Range of Fire. The shadow of Fort Sumter lay behind them, a dark stain on the brightening water. The CSS Planter was now steaming through the channel known as the Swash, a route that led directly out to the open sea and directly toward the waiting guns of the Union Navy. Inside the pilot house, the silence was absolute. Robert Smalls gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't dare look back. To look back was to invite the monster to wake up. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the skeletal masts of the Federal blockade fleet were becoming clearer by the second. "Are they firing?" John Small's voice crackled through the speaking tube, trembling with a mixture of hope and terror. "Not yet," Robert replied, his voice tight. "Keep her steady. We ain't out of reach yet." They were in the dead zone, that terrifying stretch of water where the Confederate guns could still reach them, but where they were too far away to be easily identified. To the sentries at Sumter, the Planter still looked like a loyal Confederate transport making an early run to the outer islands. But Robert had just altered course. Instead of turning toward Morris Island as expected, he had pointed the bow straight out to sea. It was a subtle deviation, but to a trained eye, it was a scream of treason. "Take off the hat, Robert," Alfred said, stepping into the pilot house. He was sweating profusely, despite the cool morning air. "We're past them. Take it off." Robert reached up and touched the brim of Captain Relay's straw hat. It had been his shield, his disguise, his ticket through the dates of hell. Now it felt like a curse. He pulled it from his head and tossed it onto the bench. He unbuttoned the heavy pea coat, letting it fall open to reveal his rough work shirt underneath. He was Robert Smalls again. But Robert Smalls was currently captaining a Confederate warship straight at the United States Navy. "The flag!" Robert said suddenly, realizing the danger. "My God, the flag!" High above them, on the mainmast, the stars and bars, the Confederate ensign was still snapping in the wind. To the Union ships ahead, that flag was a target. It marked them as an enemy ram, a blockade runner, or a suicide vessel coming to attack. "John! Alfred!" Robert shouted, abandoning the speaking tube and yelling through the open door. "Get that rag down, now! If the Yankees see it, they'll sink us before we can say a word." Alfred scrambled up the rigging like a monkey. His fingers fumbled with the halyards, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The Confederate flag, the symbol of their bondage, refused to come down easily. It tangled for a heart-stopping moment before finally sliding down the mast, collapsing onto the deck in a heap of red, white, and blue rebellion. "Get the sheet," Robert roared. "Run it up, fast!" Hannah had prepared for this. From the bundle of belongings she had brought on board, she pulled out a large white bedsheet. It was a simple object, cotton, hemmed by hand, used to cover a mattress in a slave cabin. But in this moment, it was the most important piece of fabric in the world. Alfred grabbed the sheet. He tied the corners to the halyard with trembling hands. "Up! Pull it up!" Robert urged, watching the Union ships grow larger in the window. He could see them clearly now. The USS Onward was the closest, a massive sailing ship with gun ports open. He could see the black muzzles of its cannons traversing, tracking the Planter's approach. Alfred hauled on the line. The white sheet jerked upward, ascending the mast where the Confederate flag had just flown. But nature, it seemed, wanted to play one last cruel trick. As the sheet reached the top of the mast, the wind suddenly died. The morning breeze that had carried them this far evaporated into dead calm. The white sheet hung limp and lifeless against the pole. It didn't flutter, it didn't wave. It looked like a bundled sail, or perhaps nothing at all from a distance. "It's not blowing," Alfred screamed from the deck. "They can't see it." Robert stared at the Onward.
A puff of white smoke appeared from the side of the Union ship, not a cannon shot, but a signal. They were preparing to fire. They saw a Confederate gunboat steaming toward them at full speed, flying no flag, seemingly on an attack run. "Turn her broadside," Robert shouted to John in the engine room. "Let them see our profile. Let them see we aren't ramming." He spun the wheel hard to starboard. The Planter groaned, heeling over as it turned broadside to the Union fleet. It was a maneuver of submission, exposing the ship's most vulnerable flank to the enemy guns. "Wave it," Robert yelled to Alfred. "Wave the damn thing." Alfred grabbed the halyard and shook it violently, trying to make the sheet dance. On the deck below, the women and children had come up from the hold. They saw the Union ship. They saw the cannons. Hannah stood by the rail, holding their son. She didn't scream. She simply held up the child, as if the sight of a baby could stop a 32-pound cannonball. "Please," Robert whispered, watching the Onward. "Don't shoot. We are bringing you a gift. Don't shoot." On the deck of the USS Onward, Acting Volunteer Lieutenant J. Frederick Nichols was peering through his spyglass. He saw the strange steamer. He saw the Confederate lines. He saw the dark crew. And then he saw it, a flash of white against the morning sky, a bedsheet flapping awkwardly as a man on the deck shook the line. "Hold fire!" Nichols bellowed to his gunners, his hand chopping the air. "Hold fire! It's a white flag!" The order echoed across the water. The gunners on the Onward, who had their lanyards pulled tight, ready to unleash hell, eased back. On the Planter, Robert saw the activity on the Union ship change. The cannons didn't retract, but the ship didn't fire. They were waiting. Robert let out a sob, a singular, rough sound that tore from his throat. He slumped over the wheel, his forehead resting against the cool wood. The tension that had held him upright for the last 4 hours finally snapped. "They see us," he choked out. "They see us." The Planter drifted in the calm water, the white bedsheet hanging limp but victorious. Behind them, the cannons of Fort Sumter remained silent, the Confederates still unaware that their ship had just defected. Ahead, the Union Navy waited. Robert straightened up. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at his crew, his friends, his family. They were weeping, hugging, falling to their knees on the deck. "Pull yourself together, men," Robert said, his voice returning to the command of a captain. "We have a delivery to make." He nudged the throttle forward. The Planter began to move again, slow and respectful, toward the wall of Union timber and iron. They were crossing the final line. They were leaving the land of the whip and entering the land of the free.
Chapter 9. Friend or Foe? The Encounter with the Onward. The USS Onward was a beast of a ship. She was a sailing vessel, a clipper converted for war, and she loomed out of the morning mist like a floating fortress. Her heavy wooden hull was black and menacing, and along her side the square gun ports were flipped open, revealing the ugly iron snouts of her cannons. On the deck of the CSS Planter, the celebration had died as quickly as it had begun. The reality of their position had slammed home. They were approaching a Union warship in a Confederate vessel, flying a bedsheet that hung limp in the dead calm. "They're traversing!" John Smalls yelled from the bow. "They're turning the guns on us!" Robert Smalls stood in the pilot house, his hands gripping the windowsill. He could see the Union gunners swarming around the cannon carriages. He could see the glint of the lanyards, the ropes that, when pulled, would send a 32-pound explosive shell tearing through the Planter's boiler, scalding everyone on board to death in seconds. "Wave it!" Robert roared to Alfred, his voice cracking with desperation. "Wave it so they can see!" Alfred grabbed the halyard of the white bedsheet and shook it violently. He jumped up and down, screaming into the windless air. "Don't shoot! For God's sakes, don't shoot! We're friends!" But the distance was too great for voices. The Onward's commander, Acting Volunteer Lieutenant J. Frederick Nichols, was looking through his glass.
To him, the Planter looked exactly like what it was, a Confederate armed transport, possibly a ram or a torpedo boat, coming out of the dawn to strike the blockade. "Stand by to fire!" The command drifted across the water, clear and terrifying. Robert felt a cold numbness spread through his limbs. They had defied the slave masters. They had fooled the sentries at the wharf. They had bluffed the guns of Fort Johnson and Fort Sumter. To die now by the hands of the very people they were running to was a cruelty he could not comprehend. He grabbed the brim of the straw hat, Captain Relay's hat, and crushed it in his hand. He stepped out of the pilot house, onto the open deck, exposing himself completely. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to see a black man, not a Confederate uniform. "Hard to port," he shouted back into the wheelhouse, steering the ship to show its defenseless broadside even more clearly. "Stop engines! Let her drift!" The paddle wheels stopped churning. The Planter began to slow, wallowing in the gentle swell. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of the rigging and the sound of water slapping against the hull. On the onward, Lieutenant Nichols hesitated. His finger hovered over the command to fire. Through his spyglass, the frantic movement on the Planter's deck finally resolved itself. It wasn't a boarding party. It wasn't a crew preparing to ram. It was a black man waving a white sheet, and beside him, other black faces, men, women, children. "Hold fire!" Lieutenant Nichols bellowed, his voice cracking with the sudden shift in adrenaline. "Hold fire! It's a runaway!" The tension on the onward snapped like a taut wire. The gunners eased the tension on the lanyards. The officers lowered their swords. The Planter drifted closer, carried by its remaining momentum until it was within hailing distance of the massive Union ship. The shadow of the onward fell over the smaller steamer, engulfing it. Robert Smalls stood tall on the paddle box. He took off the straw hat he had worn to steal his freedom and held it against his chest. He looked up at the line of white faces peering down from him on the onward's rail, faces that looked at him not with hatred, but with astonishment. "Ship ahoy!" Lieutenant Nichols called out, his voice stern but curious. "State your business." Robert took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this line in his head 1,000 times over the last few years, dreaming of a moment he never truly thought would come. He looked the Union commander in the eye, a grin breaking through the mask of fear he had worn all night. "Good morning, sir," Robert shouted clear and proud across the water. "I have brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." For a second, there was silence. The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the air. He brought the guns back. Then a cheer erupted from the onward. It started as a ripple among the gun crews and swelled into a roar. The Union sailors threw their caps into the air. They climbed the rigging to get a better look. They cheered for the courage, for the prize, and for the sheer impossible brilliance of what they were witnessing. "Come alongside," Lieutenant Nichols ordered, a smile finally breaking his composure. As the Planter tied up to the onward, the hatch of the cargo hold opened. Hannah climbed out, holding their son, Robert Jr. Beside her came the other wives and children. They blinked in the bright morning sun, looking up at the American flag flying from the onward's mast, the stars and stripes. It was real. The nightmare of the auction block was over. The fear of the lash was gone. Robert walked down to the main deck to meet the boarding party. He was no longer a piece of property. He was no longer a wheelman for the Confederacy. He was Robert Smalls, a man who had stolen a warship to save his family. A Union officer jumped onto the deck of the Planter, his hand not to arrest, but to greet. "Welcome aboard, Captain," the officer said. Robert took the hand. It was the first time a white man had ever shaken his hand as an equal. "Thank you, sir," Robert said, tears finally spilling down his cheeks, mixing with the coal dust and the salt spray. "It is a very good morning indeed."
Chapter 10. A Gift to the Union.
The morning sun was now fully risen, bathing the Atlantic in a brilliant golden light that felt less like weather and more like a benediction. The CSS Planter, once a vessel of Confederate logistics, now bobbed in the gentle swell alongside the USS Wabash, the massive flagship of the South Atlantic blockading squadron. News had spread through the Union fleet like wildfire. A slave has stolen a rebel gunboat. He brought his family. He brought the guns. Sailors lined the rails of every ship in the vicinity, the Onward, the Augusta, the Wabash, straining to catch a glimpse of the black captain and his audacious crew. Robert Smalls stood on the deck of the Planter, his wife Hannah beside him. For the first time in his life, he was not looking over his shoulder. He was looking up at the stars and stripes snapping crisply in the wind atop the Wabash. A launch was sent from the flagship. A young officer stiffly invited Robert to board and meet with Flag Officer Samuel Francis DuPont, the commander of the fleet. Robert smoothed the front of his rough shirt. He had no dress uniform. He had no rank. But as he stepped onto the polished deck of the Wabash, he carried himself with a dignity that outshone any gold braid. Flag Officer DuPont was a man of the old Navy, stern, disciplined, and not easily impressed. He stood on the quarterdeck, surrounded by his staff. He watched Robert approach with a critical eye. "State your name and your vessel," DuPont said, though he already knew. "I am Robert Smalls, sir," Robert replied, his voice steady and resonant, "and I have the honor to present to you the Planter. She was intended to fight against my country, but I thought she might be of better service to the Union." A ripple of surprised laughter and approval went through the gathered officers. My country. It was a bold claim for a man who, under the laws of that country, as interpreted by the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, was not even a citizen. But Robert had decided that citizenship was not something granted by a piece of paper. It was something earned by blood and courage. "And what cargo do you bring, Mr. Smalls?" Flag Officer DuPont asked, a slight smile touching his lips. "Beyond the ship herself, sir," Robert began, ticking off the items on his fingers. "I have brought you 4 heavy guns meant for the forts, a 7-inch rifled gun, a bandit rifle, and 2 smoothbores. I have the Planter's own armament. I have the Confederate code book containing all the secret signals for the harbor defenses, and—" He paused, looking back toward the jagged line of Charleston Harbour. "In the places of the torpedoes and mines laid in the channels. I can show you where the danger lies, sir. I can show you how to take the city." DuPont was silent for a long moment. This wasn't just a stolen ship, it was an intelligence coup of the highest order. The codes alone were worth a fleet of ships. The mine locations would save countless Union lives. "You have done a great service to the United States," DuPont said, extending his hand, "a service that shall not be forgotten. You and your crew are free men from this moment forward." Free men. The words hung in the air, sweeter than any hymn Robert had ever heard in church. Back on the Planter, the celebration had begun in earnest. The Union sailors, overcoming their initial shock, were cheering the escapees. Food and water were passed down. The terror of the night, the crouching in the dark, the fear of the cannon fire, the dread of the auction block began to dissolve into the reality of liberation. But for Robert, the victory was not just personal. He knew that in the North, and indeed in the South, there was a prevailing belief that black men would not fight, that they were docile and content in their chains. With one turn of the wheel, Robert Smalls had shattered that lie forever. In the months that followed, the story of the Planter would travel across the divided nation. It would be printed in the New York Tribune and Harper's Weekly. It would be whispered in the slave quarters of Virginia and Georgia, igniting sparks of hope in millions of hearts. It would reach the desk of President Abraham Lincoln, influencing his decision to allow African American men to officially enlist and fight for the Union Army.
Congress would pass a special act awarding Robert and his crew half the appraised value of the Planter as prize money. Robert would receive $1,500, a fortune for a man who had started the day with nothing but his clothes on his back. But the money was secondary. Robert looked at Hannah, who was holding their son up to see the Northern officers. The boy would grow up free. He would learn to read without fear of the whip. He would work for wages, not for a master's profit. Robert turned back to DuPont. "Sir, I have one request." "Name it," the flag officer said. "I know the waters of Charleston better than any man in your fleet. I know the tides, the shoals, and the creeks. Do not send me north to sit out the war. Let me stay. Let me fight. Let me pilot the Planter back into that harbor under your flag and help finish this." DuPont looked at the man before him, the old slave who was now, in every way that mattered, a captain. "Granted," DuPont said. And so the Planter would return to war, this time with Robert Smalls officially at the helm, fighting to liberate the city that had enslaved him. As the sun climbed higher, casting its light over the vast open ocean, Robert Smalls took a deep breath of the salt air. It was the same air he had breathed yesterday, but the chemistry had changed. It no longer smelled of pluff mud and despair. It smelled like the future. He had stolen a ship, he had stolen his family, and in the process he had stolen his destiny from the hands of history and rewritten it in his own name. The Planter rocked gently on the waves, a small wooden vessel that had carried a colossal weight, but the weight was gone now. The chains were broken. Captain Robert Smalls turned to the north, toward the open sea and the rest of his life. "Full steam ahead," he whispered.